Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Exploring Environmental Enrichment, the Importance of Challenge with Dr. Brian Greco. I'm Nicole Cass, CE Program Manager for the Minnesota Veterinary Medical Association, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. If you do have any questions during the session, please be sure to type them in the Q&A area, and we'll get to them as we are able to. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Greco. Dr. Greco's scholarly and research interests are directed towards understanding how housing complexity, the use of operant conditioning, and the predictability of management handling events influence stereotypic, anticipatory, and social behavior. He's also interested in using cognitive challenges to enhance environmental enrichment practices and to support progressive animal care practices. He is currently an assistant professor in the Animal and Food Science Department at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. In this capacity, he teaches several undergraduate level classes addressing animal behavior, training, ethics, and welfare in the context of agriculture, companionship, research, and zoos. He also serves as the faculty advisor to the UWRF Animal Welfare Judging Team and Care Club. In addition to his academic appointment, Dr. Greco has served as a consulting animal welfare scientist for AWARE Institute since 2014. Through AWARE, he works on a variety of projects addressing welfare issues for elephants, centaurs, canines, and primates. He is the author of peer-reviewed papers of stereotypic behavior, animal management, and animal learning. Prior to becoming an academic, Dr. Greco was a zoo elephant trainer and has illustrated the covers and figures of several publications. I'd like to turn it over to him.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my discussion today. I like to run presentations and discussions in a bit of an interruptee style. So, Nicole, if you get any questions that seem pressing, or if anybody has them, then that's fine. We can stop and chat. It's better to get questions answered when they're relevant than make sure we get through all the content. So hopefully we'll be able to do both.
Sounds great. I'll let you know.
Let's get going. Goals for this presentation: I'm going to define environmental enrichment, discuss the importance of challenge, identify methods that provide challenge, and review the assessment of enrichment practice. So let's break down the etymology of environmental enrichment. So the environment refers to the surrounding conditions in which an animal lives. Animals in human care are housed in a continuum of environments that range from low-quality, solitary, barren enclosures to higher-quality, complex, from a physical and social perspective, habitat. This classification system is derived from studies on the development of behavior using laboratory animals as models. So you may be familiar with Henry Harlow or Yerkes from primate studies, and Hebb, who studied rats. It also develops from a parallel trend within zoo management, in which zoo managers were looking for management practices that were designed to maintain physical health. So they developed poured concrete exhibits because they were easy to clean. They started hand-feeding carnivores instead of providing them with whole carcasses to eat, and they provided them with some toys and entertainments, which is what they were called originally back in the day. So photo-wise, you can see the penguin enclosure. It's a famous enclosure in the London Zoo. That's a good example of how you have this emerging ideology where they're trying to make exhibits appealing, but also quote-unquote healthy for the animals. And in doing this, they found consistently across settings that those environments that were barren or were associated with serious welfare compromises, while those that had increased quality and complexity tended to protect against many of these compromises. Now, the term of enrichment is a bit confusing. Early in the 20th century, when those individuals were starting out this process, they referred to complex environments as enriched because they were more complex than the basic environment that most animals lived in, or they were different from those intentionally deprived environments. However, over the last several decades and into the late 20th century, behavioral engineers like Hal Markowitz helped develop and evolve the term enrichment so that it now specifically refers to transient care practices designed to support positive welfare through the enhancement of the quality or value of the environment in which an animal lives. When we look at environmental enrichment as a whole, the practices are highly context-specific. In order to provide enrichment in a meaningful manner, it's important to assess the base environment first to determine where it stands in that continuum. Is it a barren environment? Is it somewhere in the middle? Is it something that's more complex? It's also important to ensure that these practices are transient in nature. Those that are transient in nature are more likely to become things that the animals engage with, and if they stay in that environment for a longer period of time and are non-transient, then those activities or items, whatever they may be, end up becoming part of the base environment. So they only add to the overall potential complexity as opposed to providing a short-term interaction or challenge, as we'll talk about coming up. Environmental enrichment is not to be confused with basic husbandry. And by basic husbandry, I mean access to resources, social partners, medical care, the types of things that animals need to survive on a very basic level. They're also not to be confused with environmental features, so things like what we refer to in the zoo business as furniture, which are things like rocks, log, foliage, basic rope climbing structures if you're dealing with something like parrots or primates. So now we have a basic foundation for what we understand to be environmental enrichment. We can really start to talk about how we're going to make these enrichment experiences optimal. And challenge is really the key to that. What we found over the decades of environmental enrichment research is that enrichment practices that present animals with challenge are the most successful at enhancing the environmental quality and supporting positive welfare. Most of what I'm going to be talking about next comes from the paper that I have in the lower left-hand corner there by Meehan and Mensch called The Challenge of Challenge. I studied under both of these for my dissertation, and I continue to work with both of these authors on enrichment questions. So I'm very knowledgeable of this subject matter, even though I'm not an author on that paper. So a question for you to at least dwell over is, does this photo show enrichment? You can answer that or not, but it's something to think about. And hopefully by the end of this conversation, you'll have a better idea of whether or not it does. So why is challenge important? Wild animals regularly face challenges stemming from interactions with other organisms or from changing environmental factors. These challenges may directly or indirectly impact their survival and must be solved in a way that minimizes the threat to their health and well-being. For this reason, animals have evolved and continue to develop a suite of cognitive and behavioral skills that are suited to dealing with the challenges of their niche. What we see with these types of challenges is that when an animal initially encounters a challenge, there's a mismatch of expectations. They expect to be able to achieve a goal. The challenge is preventing them from achieving that goal. This leads to frustration. And frustration leads to an increased motivation to get to that goal and overcome the challenge. When animals use a species' appropriate set of skills to solve that challenge, there's a relief of frustration. There's a release of opioids. And they get access to whatever the goal was that they wanted. So what we see is that correct choices about skill application result in internal reinforcement in the form of positive emotional states. So solving problems is something that animals have evolved to do and are rewarded for doing. So finding ways to overcome problems is very highly internally motivated. The difficulty with challenge in managed settings is complex. First, most of the challenges that animals face are not appropriate to species-specific or learned skill sets. So if we look at this rat house, it looks nice and relatively complex, However, there are some challenges in here that are not going to be appropriate for the rat, and that their evolved skill set and the skills that they've continued to develop cannot overcome. If there are resources that are outside of this enclosure, those walls prevent the rat from getting out. It cannot use any set of skills to get to the resources that are not there. It's also possible that some of these things that are in this environment are non-ideal. So for example, the way the food is presented down here in the corner with the bowls and the water is being presented in a bowl. That's not something that animals face on a regular basis and have evolved to face, getting food in a specific place, chopped up in little bits. Rats and other animals have to forage for their food. So these challenges that they're facing are either so complex that they can't overcome them, or they're very, very simple. So let's talk about some of these overly complex challenges. So if we have an animal that's alone in a barren environment, it cannot control access to desired resources or social partners in using their skills that they currently have or their learned skills. This contributes to frustration, anxiety, and boredom. And this may cause the use of skills in an inappropriate manner in an attempt to relieve frustration, anxiety, or boredom. And over time, the repeated use of behaviors in that manner can lead to the development of stereotypic behavior. So this is a video of a gerbil in a glass fish tank, and it is doing what we refer to as a corner digging stereotypic behavior. This stems from the gerbil's drive to dig and burrow. And in this particular environment, it has no substrate to burrow in. It has no ability to create a shelter that it feels is protected because there's glass on one side and it can be seen. So what we see with gerbils that are housed in this particular setting, in a lab or at home, is that they and other rodents like mice and rats sometimes do something very similar, is that they attempt to burrow any way that they can. And over time, this is misdirected in an attempt, again, to relieve that frustration or anxiety. And it starts to develop these permanent links in the central nervous system where the behavior starts to be performed very frequently and in situations where it's not appropriate. The overly simple and repetitive challenges are equally problematic. For example, many people have dogs that they house socially in a constant environment in their house. Although the social environment offers more opportunities for decision making and is potentially a more complex base environment, the challenges that are presented by that social group after they've been together for a long time may require repetition of known skills and rarely require the application of skills in a new manner. So what you then have is that skills can be used in an appropriate manner in an attempt to create new social challenges or relieve boredom. So, the picture here where we have the dogs who have ripped up the house. It's quite possible that there were no other activities for the dogs to engage in, and one of the ways they decided to create a challenge for themselves and for the social group was to rip up the furniture. That made the social environment more enriching and interesting. It made potentially for some social conflicts that needed to be resolved. And it was a way for them to become more engaged with an environment that was potentially constant and repetitive. So, how do we provide appropriate challenge? Was that a ping of a question? Is that what that was? No, something else. Cool.
No, it was something else.
Okay. Well, we need to identify what we consider to be appropriate challenge. So when we think about challenge, we think about it on this spectrum ranging from low challenge to high challenge and low skill to high skill. If animals are experiencing something that is not challenging and they don't have very good skills because they've not had the opportunity to develop those skills. Then you have them in a position where they're experiencing apathy. And this spectrum was originally developed by psychologists with humans, and we have replicated this in some cases with animals. There's a good indication that there's a very similar perception going on. If you have low skill and high challenge, so that means the challenge is too complicated, and the animal doesn't have the appropriate skills to solve that challenge, you have anxiety or frustration. The challenge is very low, but the skill is high, you have boredom. But we have to hit that sweet spot. You need to find the challenge that's appropriate to each individual or to the group, in which the challenge is high and it meets that individual or group's skill level. Once they're in this state, we consider this to be a flow state. Some of you may be familiar with the flow state. It's where you engage in a task and that task is really well met to your skill set and you start to lose track of time. It becomes very internally motivating and rewarding. So that's something that was developed largely in human psychology, and there's good evidence that animals can enter this flow state as well. When we look at the commercially available enrichments that we provide our companion animals, zoo animals, lab animals, ag animals, whatever it is, they tend to require very little variation in skill application. Especially with the products that are designed for our companion animals, we see that they are designed to look appealing to humans, but they may not provide challenge. So I'd like you to look at these ones and think to yourself or send to the chat or whatever, whether these items are challenging. You've got the ball that rolls and food comes out, the blue flow go-go bell hopper thing where the food comes out, and the daddy eyes, whatever it is, orange egg where the food comes out. So think about this with what we've just talked about. Do you think these things are challenging? If we look carefully at these, all of them require pushing an object around until food pops out, which is variable reinforcement. The challenge associated with these for most animals with higher skill competency is pretty low. Once they've learned that task, it's going to be repeated over and over and over again. And the only thing that really promotes any sort of motivation to engage with it is this variable reinforcement. It's the slot machine of in-home enrichment. So they may be engaged with it from the perspective of their being reinforced variably. But that does not mean that they're engaged with it in a flow state or from a cognitive perspective where we're seeing these really internally motivated states from that indicate flow or indicate positive welfare. What it could indicate is that they're engaging with it simply because they occasionally get food, and in reality, they're quite bored with those items. Some of the things that we provide our animals do provide challenge and can require high skill. So this puzzle might be an example of something when it's first presented to a dog as something that requires high skill and is high challenge. But what happens is that it offers the same challenge over and over again. And once the animal learns the necessary skills, the task becomes easy and less interesting. So if our available products fail to be challenging, how exactly do we provide challenge for animals? So I'm going to talk about human game design for a minute. Many of you, or none of you, I don't know what your backgrounds are, may be familiar with Metroidvania games. This is a video game style or variety that's based around non-linear design in which your character acquires skills in a quasi-random manner. So if you see off to the right, there's a map of all the places that you could potentially go in this game. You start the game at the beginning with a very minimal set of skills, and most of the map is blocked. So you really can't get anywhere. What is required to make progress is that you need to obtain new skills. And in order to obtain those new skills, you have to combine the existing skills that you have in order to unlock doors or beat or pass boss monsters. Sound familiar? Some of you may or may not be familiar with games. So, based on that limited information that I gave you, which type of game would you prefer to play, assuming you like to play games? Would you rather have access to the first level where all you have is a single limited set of skills and you solve the same problems over and over and over again? Or would you prefer to have the full game where you have access to a wide variety of skills and are required to apply those skills in novel ways in order to gain access to new areas and get new skills? My guess is that most of you would probably prefer the full game and would consider it to be more entertaining, again, assuming that you like video games. So why is that? What is going on here that makes this game more entertaining in the full variety than in the limited early access variety? So the reason is that Metroidvanias rely on something called behavioral or cognitive layering. You have a modifiable task that provides continued challenge with each addition of every new skill. So the tasks that you have are not necessarily object-based, and the challenge that you are exposed to stems from knowing when and how to switch between your items or your skills and applying them in new ways, adding new combinations together, using them in novel ways, trying them out on different environmental features to see if there's an effect, whatever it might be. You're consistently changing and altering the use of the skills that you know and trying to pursue and learn new skills. So this tastes like a combination of who cares and so what? Like, why is all of this so important? What's the motivation and drive? Why are we discussing this today? So the goals of environmental enrichment per Meehan and Mensch are that these practices are, again, transient in nature, as we had talked about. They appropriately address gaps in environmental complexity because, again, we need to assess that base environment before we start to develop our enrichment plans or develop our enrichment activities. And they're addressing gaps through appropriate challenge in that animal's behavioral repertoire. Over time, as we use these practices, we'll see that enrichment events become layered so that once the animal learns a particular skill path, learns how to solve a particular problem, you layer in another challenge on top of that. You make it a little bit harder. So if you're thinking about this tube feeder thing off to the left, the goal is down there in the gold star to the right-hand side of it. In order to get to that, the animal needs to weave their arm, trunk, whatever it may be, through a series of balls that are not necessarily aligned. To start out with this task, you may have to introduce it where it's just a tube and the animal has to learn to unbury, expose the end of the tube, and then reach down and grab the food item. Over time, you layer in challenge by adding in those balls that they have to rotate, find the holes that they need to weave their arm or trunk through in order to get that reward at the bottom. And you can continue to make this task more and more challenging over time. So how do we meet these goals? First, we need to know our species well and pay attention to the environmental resources they rely upon and those that challenge the species. We also need to know the behavioral and cognitive skills by these animals to solve niche-specific challenges. What type of cognitive mapping do they use? How do they learn best? Do they have good visual capabilities, auditory capabilities? How dexterous are their hands, their feet, their tails, their mouths, their tongues, whatever it might be? How do they process food on a regular basis? We need to know what our animal's managed environment lacks. If I'm housing rats, do they lack digging opportunities? Do they lack appropriate social opportunities? Do they lack the ability to forage for, find, and process food items? Whatever it might be, we need to think about that. We need to know which behavioral or cognitive skills the species lacks the ability to express regularly in managed care, and how we might promote those skills is what we're going to start thinking about. Let's talk about a couple of behavioral or cognitive enrichment solutions that meet all of these goals. I'm going to go over two of them: time and animal activated events and coin economies. So some of these are things that I have developed but have been inspired by or proposed by Hal Markowitz. If you're not familiar with him, he is someone that was active in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He has a fantastic book called Behavioral Enrichment in the Zoo. It was published in 1982. It is a really interesting case where he went into the Oregon Zoo and he built a bunch of really interesting and complex apparatus for animals to engage with the idea that he could tap into some of those environmental skills. At the time, and currently, his ideas get a lot of pushback in the zoo industry specifically because those things that he built didn't mesh and look very nice in the exhibit spaces. And his argument, and my argument, based on the challenge idea, is that it shouldn't matter what things look like to your guests. We don't necessarily care about the guest's well-being or welfare. What's most important is the animal's experience. The same could be applied in the home with our companion species. That the most important thing is that those companion animals are stimulated and engaged in the opportunities that they have, more so than whether or not that thing is orange and it matches the color of the shag that I have on my couch and it's a good fit for the aesthetic of my home. Or I like how it looks and I think that's going to be fun because it appeals to the younger me when I was young and I really liked playing with brightly colored toys. We want to think about most is the animal's perspective. And these two types of solutions that I'm going to talk about really do that. They really tap into the animal's perspective. There are other ones that I can talk about, but we're going to focus on these ones. So time and animal activated events. Excuse me, I'm going to grab a sip of water here, move on with that. All right, so the way this works is that the animal is trained or learns through trial and error to pull a lever or a rope to gain access to a desired resource. So the classic rat hopper that you may or may not have seen in the operant conditioning labs of old and current, that's a good example of how that works. They push the lever, they get something for it. Once they've learned to push that lever, the animal is conditioned through classical conditioning only to pull the lever or rope when there is an environmental cue. In the case of the photo here, we have a light that goes on that tells that animal, this thing is available. If you push that lever now, you will get whatever resource it is that you want. We then introduce the cue to the animal activated apparatus into whatever that animal's environment, its home cage, its habitat, the house itself. You could easily do this with dogs or cats or parrots, lizards, whatever it is you have in your home, you could do this. Then we need to start layering in challenge. Now the animal knows that if the light goes on, it can push a button, it can get something out of it. what can we start to think about to layer in challenge? There are many options, but I'm just going to name off a few so you can start to think about this. So you could move the location of the cue away from the hopper. So now the light goes on. That means there's a hopper available somewhere in the environment. So now that animal needs to go and search their environment, be engaged with their environment to go and identify and find that resource. That better matches their naturalistic environment. When it smells like bananas, the banana tree is probably ripe. I should probably go and find the banana tree. If the berries are red, that means the berries are ripe. I should probably go and try those berries if I'm motivated to do so. If I hear rustling in the bushes, that may be an indication that there are mice or rats or rodent or bugs there that I could consume or hunt. You could set up the cue on a semi-randomized timer so that it now goes off for a particular amount of time, and that animal has a limited amount of time to be able to find this thing. So that's, again, more akin to the types of things that animals have been evolved to deal with. Resources enter into the environment, and they leave the environment, and you need to take the advantage of the opportunity that you are given to either consume that resource or decide to avoid it. Sometimes, if you are a predator, or sometimes if you are an herbivore, food-based resources, which is what we often use in enrichments, they no longer become available. Prey escape, berries get rotten, they fall off the trees, they get eaten by others. Then we can set up many animal-activated hoppers around the environment. When cued, the animal must search among all of the hoppers to find the active one. So again, similar idea. You hear rodents as some sort of predator, you start searching around the near environment to see if you can find the location of it. You use the cues in the environment to help you understand whether or not that particular resource is available. You're a mouse, you smell berries, then you go and look for where those berries might be in places that you have known berries to be before. So why are these types of time and animal-activated events likely to provide challenge? First, the animals are no longer relying on unclear or semi-predictable cues to make decisions about the environment and how they interact with it. So this is a really big issue in the zoo environment. It's also a really big issue in our homes, is that throughout the day, we do things with the animals that we manage that they become classically conditioned to understand may have a relationship to some sort of resource that they want. So you jingle your keys, that may mean to the animal in the zoo that food is coming soon. It may mean nothing. Same with at home, you get your keys, you jingle your keys, you take them out of your pocket. The dog might interpret that as it's time to go for a walk. It also might mean nothing. So again, you have variable reinforcement working against you. They're motivated to respond to that cue because sometimes there's a valuable reward associated with it. The problem is that when we do that, we're creating situations that can cause serious states of frustration or anxiety because they lack skills to achieve whatever the goal or outcome is when they respond inappropriately to the cue that is not necessarily paired with the resource. So this really helps to make their environments more interactable and more linked to the way that they would find or engage with their environment that they've evolved to do. So resources are then now obtainable through the use of appropriate skills. You're not waiting at the door because you have heard the keys jingle. You're not waiting at a gate if you're a zoo animal because that's where your food might come from if the zookeeper decides to go there. You're not going to the front of your housing cage, your housing kennel, in a shelter because the door opened to the shelter room, and sometimes that's associated with people coming to look at you or provide you with food. So again, this means that the environment is better able to match that animal's natural environment and the skills that they've evolved and adapted to use in that environment. So what cognitive skills are these types of activities likely to require? Learning, they need to learn how to pull that lever, engage and perceive that cue, link the cue together with the lever press. Decision making, they need to decide whether to act or ignore the cue when it's given. Cognitive mapping, they need to remember where all possible locations are where that resource was available. Discrimination, they need to understand that only specific cues are associated with specific events. So a white light might mean there's corn available, or red light might mean there's chow available. The blue light might mean it's time to get some fresh water. It really varies, and again, you can layer in a variety of different challenges. That's not one I talked about in the example, but you could have different cues meaning different things. Okay, so that is the time-activated event. And again, the claims that I'm making here are really based on inductive reasoning and not research. I'm engaged with some research that I will talk about at the end of this presentation that helps me make these conclusions on preliminary research and inductive arguments. So the second example I want to talk about is a coin economy. This is really something that Hal Markowitz developed and I used when I was an elephant trainer to work with our elephants on when I was at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park. So the way the coin economy works is that the animal is trained in object retrieval. You teach them, get that object, bring it back to me. When you get it, you get positively reinforced for something. Then you condition a coin. So this is a specific object that is classically paired with a specific reinforcer. So in the case of our elephants, they really liked alfalfa hay. It was not something that we regularly put out in the habitat because they would eat it all very quickly, or the most dominant elephant would hoard it and eat it all and no one else could gain access to it. So this was a good item that we could use for those animals that we knew they were highly motivated for, but wanted to make it a little more complex. Then you start to fade out the human. The retrieval event now occurs organically in the environment, so that when the animal goes into their environment, in this case it's an elephant, that coin is hidden somewhere in the environment. The animal has to find that coin and bring it back to the person or an automated hopper where they can then exchange it for whatever resource they're interested in. Once you've got that basic idea down, we're moving on to hiding the coins and layering in this challenge. So again, there's a lot of ways we can layer in challenge. I'm going to give you some examples. So first, you can add false coins. You can have coins in the environment that are of a different shape, a different color, a different smell, a different texture. And these things are not going to be associated with anything. So if the animal attempts to put it in the hopper or return it to a person, they're not going to get the reward that they want. They need to go back into their environment, search for the appropriate coin, and return it to gain access to the appropriate resource. You can add coin automated hoppers using things like RFID tags or a particular shape, like those boxes that we have for children where you have to fit the cylinder in the cylinder hole and the triangle in the triangle hole, and the other ones don't fit in any particular hole. It has to go in the right one in order for the puzzle to be solved. Same idea. You can increase the value of the resource so that now instead of 1 coin to gain access to that particular resource, it costs 5 coins or 6 coins or whatever. So here's a quick video of one of the elephants I worked with doing this particular thing. This is staged, by the way, for the purpose of filming this, but you get the idea. He does have to actually find the item. In this case, it is a blue piece of plastic scented with ground up ginger and grape leaf oil. So for the most part, this elephant Misholo, when I gave him this opportunity, he would go around his environment and use his trunk to find that particular scent. If you gave him a false coin, he would pick up, he would either find it and throw it, and then he'd go around looking for the appropriate one. See here, he returns it. He gets his alfalfa. He's a happy boy. He's going to eat it. You can do this exact same thing with dogs, cats, parrots, reptiles, whatever it is that you have. With the right amount of training and engagement, you can certainly do this in the home. Now, unlike the animal activated activities, it's not exactly analogous to something that an animal would have evolved to do in the wild, but it does include skills that an animal needs to, has evolved to use, and skills that it can develop to use, again, in order to keep it engaged with its environment and make their day-to-day experiences a little bit more interesting. So again, we see that this task requires learning. They need to learn the retrieval. They need to learn the association between the coin and the reward. They need to learn which coins are valuable, which coins are not. They may need to learn which coins are associated with each of their social partners, so that sometimes they may decide to hide coins for their social partners or hoard coins for the social partners, so that then that social partner needs to engage with them in a particular way before they have access to it. They need to engage in decision making. They need to decide to search for coins or not. They need to decide to hold coins until they're available to exchange it, or determine how to make the best exchange without alerting the attention of social partners. So this particular elephant, Misholo, when he did it, he was the best of the ones that I trained it with, mostly because he's doing it the longest. One of the things he would do when we finished setting up the yard, we'd move him from one habitat to another, open the gate between the two. One of the first things he would do is run around and look for his coin. All the other elephants would be going around and socializing and eating the other things that we put out. He'd go look for his coin. As soon as he found it, he'd put it in his mouth and hold it in his mouth until he decided it was time to exchange it. So sometimes that would be within a few minutes. Sometimes it was several hours later. He'd walk up, you get this big, slobbery, disgusting coin, and then he would like to have his alfalfa. So it required, a lot of clear decision making on his part, and helped him control access to resources when he wanted it, as opposed to only having it available, requiring that he eat it before all the other elephants eat it, whether or not he actually wanted it then. Requires some spatial mapping. You need to remember and consider where coins were previously hidden, and explore new locations where coins have not been hidden. There needs to be discrimination. They need to understand that only specific coins result in reward, or that your coins are valuable and not other coins. Counting can be important. Elephants and other animals are quite capable of counting, and they may need to pick up, if you increase the value, a number of coins before they can have that to get the appropriate exchange rate. So when we think about these solutions to challenge in the managed environment, we're seeing that they are really well adapted to dealing with a variety of behavioral problems. So we all know that the conditions of management can lead to those situations in which the animal becomes frustrated. They may develop stereotypic behavior. Lack of control over the environment can lead to things like waiting and anticipatory behavior. So these are non-optimal behaviors. These types of cognitive solutions can help with waiting, stereotypic, and anticipatory behavior. They can help with low environmental engagement rates, low behavioral diversity rates, or long abnormal resting bouts. And really, why is this? Because the animals now have more incentive to explore the environment, the resources are obtainable through the use of more appropriate skills, and the environment better matches the animal's natural environment and their evolved skill set. More importantly, their evolved skill set than the natural environment as far as how it looks, but more so how it functions and how it interacts with their evolved skills. So now we need to know, how do we know that the things we're doing are working? We don't know. That's not very helpful now, is it? So something that's been developed in the zoo industry that I think is applicable all around and is pretty straightforward and logical is the S.P.I.D.E.R model. So step 1, you set goals. 2, you plan. 3, you implement. 4, you document. 5, you evaluate. And 6, you readjust. And this was proposed by Mellon and McPhee in 2001. So to kind of go over this model with a little more detail, first you need to set the goals. This is, what do you want the enrichment to do? What behaviors do you want to elicit? What's the challenge you want to offer those animals? What types of skills do you want to tap into? What types of things are lacking in the environment, and how do you intend to address that? Planning, that's the designing the stuff, the building of it, the setting up of it, and the seeking of approval for activities from managers if you're working in a situation where that needs to be done. If you are at home and you're asking your children to help you build and do these things with your animals, maybe they need to come to an adult and say, hey, do you think this is safe for the guinea pig? Implementing it, you got to do it. Do it now. 4, document it. Record the events to make sure that they're not being redundant. You're not offering the same challenges over and over and over again, or the same variety of challenges with too much frequency. Make sure that the animals are observed during events to ensure that the desired goals are achieved, or that if there is some other response to that apparatus or event, you're able to understand what it is and what they're doing with it. Sometimes that can be really interesting and rewarding from the perspective of you, the animal caretaker or manager, because you can see some really interesting things that are being elicited. 3, observe the animals in a pre and post manner to ensure that the desired goals are achieved. So watch what they do in their environment beforehand. Say, it looks like these skills are missing. Post, I gave it to them. Now they are using these skills. They are doing these behaviors, or they are not. 5, evaluate it. Review the records to determine if the goals were met on an event-by-event basis, or more broadly, in a broader term perspective. 6, readjust. You got to tweak things. You need to lower or increase the challenge based on how those animals interacted with it. You may need to start over again, come up with completely new design, whatever it may be. Readjusting is equivalent to layering, cognitive layering that we were talking about before. All right, so I'm going to talk very briefly about the Elephant Welfare Initiative. It's one of the things that I'm currently working on. It is an online software tool that was built for a consortium of zoos to help them monitor the welfare of their elephants. On a day-to-day basis, they put in management information about the elephant's daily experiences. They also do 2 times weekly, they observe their elephants for 20 minutes apiece so they can get some behavior records. And all of this goes into this big system where we can look at the data, how it plays out, and eventually use this information in an epidemiological style analyses or on a zoo-by-zoo basis so that they can see how trends change over time. So one of the things that's included in this is an enrichment recording system. It has some very good benefits to it. It's probably one of the more robust systems that's available to the broader population in a consistent manner. But it has some holes in it that would need to be addressed at the individual zoo level. Again, this is population level information. So, for example, one of the things that we've done is standardize our definitions for the types of events that those animals get by making a behavioral or cognitive goals list so that when they provide their elephants with enrichment, they can tick off which any of these 6 categories or combinations of these categories that were associated with that particular event. So they had a cognitive event, elephant activated event, exploration, manipulation.
Brian, I think we lost your sound. It appears that we're having some audio issues, so please bear with us while we try and figure this out. Do you want to try to reconnect your audio, Dr. Greco? Are the attendees able to hear me without a problem? Okay. Great. Thank you.
Connecting a new audio device.
There we go. We got you back.
Okay, you got anything yet?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you so much. Not
Speaking.
sure what
It says
happened.
I'm speaking.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Chat. Getting the speaking cue from WebEx. My mic. Okay, yeah, you can hear now? Great. Okay. Just a minor hiccup. All right, so this can also be used to compare a variety of different behavioral observation types to the diversity in enrichment experiences that they're getting. So we have a metric called environmental engagement, which looks at the frequency with which the elephants are observed engaging with enrichment apparatus, performing self-maintenance, or engaging with objects that are not enrichment apparatus, and feeding diversity, which again goes into some of that enrichment apparatus that includes feed net. So that was the last slide. Fortunately, now we're essentially done. A slow end there. And let's see. I think we have some Q&A. I have one question. That's it. Really good point. Okay. Thank you, Susan, for the really good point. Nicole, if we have any questions, I guess now's a good time to go over those. Or if anybody else has questions, have at it, please.
Yeah, please remember to type your question in the Q&A area. Sorry about that. Yes, please remember to type your question in the Q&A area. While people are doing that, if you're not a fast typer, I just want to remind you that I will send out an evaluation after this, along with your CE certificate, so you can see that will come along this afternoon in your email box. I want to thank Dr. Greco for his time and enriching us on the animal care environments and how we can be evaluating behavior and making the environment enrichment for our animals. And thank you, everyone who attended today. I see we have a couple of comments and questions there. So are you able to see them, Dr. Greco? Are you able to see the questions coming in from our attendees or not? I can repeat them for you. Are you able to hear me now? Sounds like he might be having issues hearing now. Not sure what's happening to our poor system today.
I think I'm there. Are you there, Nicole?
Yes, I am here.
Yes,
I can
okay.
hear you now.
All right, good. So we have a question of, do you have any ideas for resources for dogs or cats using the principles we talked about today? Everything that we talked about today can be used for dogs and cats. So there are really no limitations on that. You can certainly use those animal activated events. So there are hoppers that you can get. There is a hopper that is more triggered by you, that's developed by Sophia Yin. Can't remember what it's called. Essentially it's a sit and stay or treat and stay or something to that effect. That can be used as a hopper. You can set it off on a timer. There's a lot of things that are timer based that you can use. You can make coin economies with your dog or cat. It will work perfectly fine. We've done a little bit of that with some of the dogs that my students use in one of their training classes. And they take some of these ideas home and then try to use them with their own animals from home in a yearly project. So I've had a couple students try both of those things. Did that answer the question?
I believe it did.
Great.
Are there any other questions? We got a comment that it's a very interesting talk and thinks the Board of Animal Health might be interested in using it to evaluate behavior in breeding facilities.
Oh, yeah. No, that could definitely be done. I'm working with S.P.I.D.E.R right now. They're doing a project on how their animals experience enrichment. So one of my colleagues who is also well-versed in enrichment, we're working together on that project. So.
And it sounds like the device you were talking about might be called the Treat and Train.
The Treat and Train, that is it. Yes, I'm drawing a complete blank. We have one for the class that I teach, and you know how it goes. Sometimes you forget.
Yes, yes. Are there any other questions at this point? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So again, thank you everyone, and thank you, Dr. Greco. We appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure, and hopefully y'all have a good rest of your day, and we have opportunity to experience each other again sometime.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.